What's going on, everybody? This is my first ever YouTube video, and I wanted my channel to be about movies and TV, so I thought, what better video to start off a movie channel than a tier ranking for the MCU? So just to jump right into it here, and just to let you know, I didn't make this tier maker. This was just automated. But so to jump right in, starting with the Iron Man franchise, the first Iron Man movie, I actually really love this movie, so I would actually put it in S tier. That's probably a little higher than most people would put it, but I mean, this is all about my opinion, so you can disagree if you want in the comments, that's fine, just keep it peaceful. Moving on to the second Iron Man, this is definitely a weaker film, one of the weaker ones in the whole MCU, but I still would put it in C tier. Generally, I would say that I have a higher ranking of a lot of movies than most people would. There's very few movies that I dislike, so my rankings are probably going to be a little higher in general than you would maybe think. For Iron Man 3, I'm going to put that in B tier. I do think it's a better movie than the second one. The second one has a little too much going on. And the third movie, I love that scene where he's just saving the people falling out of the plane. I think there's not quite enough scenes like that in the MCU of the heroes just saving everyday people rather than directly fighting the bad guy. So I really appreciated that scene. Moving on next to the Thor franchise. The first movie, it's okay. I love the actors in this movie. I thought the casting was incredible, but overall it's a little bit dull. So I'm going to place this one in the C tier as well, but I'm actually going to put it above Iron Man 2. And next we come to easily the worst movie in the franchise in my opinion, Thor the Dark World. I'm just going to put that straight in F tier. We don't really have to talk about that. And then this Thor series, is really the most all over the place in the MCU because we immediately go from the worst movie to one of my favorites in the entire franchise with Thor Ragnarok. And I'm going to put that as a strong A tier. I love that this movie brought in some new life, some new comedy to Thor. The only thing that holds it back from S tier for me is that it's just a little too comedic at times. There's not enough, it doesn't let you sit in the drama as much as I wish it did, but overall, very strong movie. Next, moving on to the Captain America series, starting off with Captain America the First Avenger. This is actually the first MCU movie that I ever saw, and I love it. I've always loved it. I think this is one that gets some hate sometimes, and I don't really understand why, because especially that first 30 minutes or so of this movie where it shows him going through that transformation, going through the training at the army base, I think it's just some amazing filmmaking, and the score in this movie is one of the best in the MCU in my opinion. So I actually am going to put this in A tier. Moving on to The Winter Soldier, which of course is many people's favorite movie in the MCU. I love this movie, but personally I don't quite hold it as high as some others. Still, for me, it's definitely going to be a strong A tier movie ahead of Thor Ragnarok. I love the spy aspect of this movie. I'm not really sure what specifically holds it back from that S tier for me. It just doesn't quite click the way I want it to. But moving on to Captain America's third movie, Civil War, this one definitely clicks for me. I would absolutely put this in S tier. I think this is the best solo movie in the MCU. It's not really a solo movie. There's so many extra characters in this, including half of the other Avengers at least. But technically it is a solo movie, so I have this as the strongest solo movie in the MCU. Next, moving on to the Ensemble Avengers movies. The first Avengers is another one that, when it came out, everybody loved this movie. Over time, I think opinions have gone down a little bit on it, but personally, my opinions haven't gone down. I still would put this in S tier, and I would actually put it just slightly ahead of Civil War because I feel like this movie is more rewatchable. It just has a few more moments in it that really stand out to me. Civil War, I love the fight scene at the end between Captain America, Iron Man, and Winter Soldier. That's potentially my favorite fight scene in the entire MCU. But the Avengers as a whole, I just enjoy it a little bit more than Civil War, and I go back and rewatch it more. So I have it a little bit above. Moving on to Age of Ultron, um, I'm actually going to put this in a B tier as well, and I'm going to put it ahead of Iron Man 3. I think when this movie first came out, it seemed like people didn't really like this one. I think opinions in general have gone up a little bit, but I still would say that there's a lot of people out there who like this movie less than I do. It's definitely not an A tier movie. There's definitely problems. The whole Quicksilver situation, the way they handled that character, I thought was awful. But overall, it's still a fun movie. Vision and what's his name? Vision and Ultron are two of my favorite characters from the comics, so I was really excited to see them come into the MCU. Was disappointed in Ultron. Vision, over time, I've grown to like his character much more, but overall, I would say this movie is right around a B tier. Next, we move on to what is my favorite movie in the entire franchise, Infinity War. I think this is a pretty common choice to be people's favorites. I mean, what can I say that hasn't been said already? They really brought together everybody in a way that just worked for me. I do think that this one is stronger than Endgame. I think that Thanos as a villain is much more menacing and much more intense in this movie than he was in Endgame. And I think he had more depth. I don't really have anything else to say. I think it's just a near perfect superhero movie. Definitely some flaws, but I just love to watch this movie. And next, the climactic ending of this Infinity Saga, Avengers Endgame. I'm going to put this in S tier, but I'm going to put it behind Infinity War and ahead of the Avengers. I do think that all three of these movies at the top here, the Avengers, Civil War, and Iron Man, are probably slightly better movies than Endgame. Maybe not Iron Man. The final fight in that is a little underwhelming, but at least Civil War and the Avengers, I think you could say, are better movies than Endgame. But Endgame was just such a movie theater experience for me that it's one of my favorites movies. I know that it has some flaws, but I just enjoy watching it. I enjoy what it was able to do. The endings to all the stories, I thought it was really well done. And in my personal opinion, I think it deserves to be up here. And now we come to one of my probably most controversial opinions, Guardians of the Galaxy. When I first watched this movie, I really, really dug it. I would have easily put it in S tier. Over time, however, the more and more I rewatch this, I'm not sure why I just like it a little bit less each time. And I'm going to have to move it down to A tier now and actually keep it below the first Avenger there. I still love these characters. I still love this movie. It just doesn't quite have the spark that it did for me on the first watch. And the same thing with Guardians 2. I mean, I love this movie. I really wanted this movie to last better than the first one lasted for me, but it just had the same effect of each time I rewatch it. I think there's just a similar issue to in Ragnarok. I think there's just a little too much comedy going on that undercuts some of the drama. However, that final scene with Yondu and all the Ravagers and the ships, that scene is incredible. It brings me to tears more than one occasion. I will put it ahead of Iron Man 3, but I'm going to keep it behind. Actually, no. I'm going to put it ahead of Age of Ultron as well here. And now, moving on to Ant-Man. The first Ant-Man I am going to put right in between Age of Ultron and Guardians 2 here. Keep in mind, B tier is still very strong here for me. I love these movies in B tier still, but they're just not. They don't stand out the way A tier movies do, and obviously the way S tier movies do. So Ant-Man, I still very much enjoy this movie, but it just doesn't quite reach that A tier level for me. Ant-Man and the Wasp being the next movie, I'm going to put this in C tier. I'm going to put it above Thor. The reason this movie's in C tier for me, I think there's a little bit of a villain issue. They're kind of boring, to me at least. I think there's a few too many villains and minor background plot lines going on in this. But overall, a fun, enjoyable movie. So C tier is where I'm going to keep this one. Moving on to my favorite character in comics, not in the MCU, but in comics in general, Spider-Man. With Spider-Man Homecoming, I absolutely love this movie. I loved it the first time I watched it. I still do. I actually went down on my opinion on this the second time I watched it, and then the third time I started to like it more and more again, and I've rewatched it a few times since then. And I'm actually going to put this up above the first Avenger and below Thor Ragnarok in A tier. I do have some issues with the way that they have had Spider-Man be kind of dependent on Iron Man in the franchise, but I do think in this first movie he does kind of hold his own quite a bit, and he fights Vulture at the end of the movie without the Iron Man suit. He proves that he can do it himself. So I do really enjoy this movie, and I think that Vulture is one of the strongest villains in the MCU. Moving on to Far From Home, I enjoyed this movie. I thought that the villain was fun, but extremely predictable. And I would probably use that word for most of this movie, is predictable. I had fun with it, but it just doesn't. It's sort of similar to what I was saying with Ant-Man. It doesn't quite reach that A tier for me, but I will say that I slightly prefer this over Guardians 2. Moving on to what many people consider to be the black sheep of the MCU, The Incredible Hulk. This is another movie that I don't understand the hate that this movie gets. I really do like this movie. It's still going to be in C tier for me. I'm going to put it below Thor, but I will gladly go back and rewatch this movie every once in a while. I think there's a lot of good qualities to it. I think the villain is, once he becomes Abomination, I think that fight between Hulk and Abomination is a lot of fun. And yeah, so moving on to Doctor Strange now. This is a movie that, similar to Guardians of the Galaxy, the first time I watched this, I loved this movie. I loved the effects. I loved the story. I loved Benedict Cumberbatch casting as Doctor Strange. And I still do love those things. But I've found some small issues with this movie over time. Primarily with the villains. I don't think that they quite hold up the way I would want a villain to. And I think some of the magic that they use with Doctor Strange is a little bit basic, and not basic, but just not what Doctor Strange is capable of in the comics. So I'd like to see in his next movie them expand on his powers a little bit more. But overall, I would say that this is a B tier movie for me. I prefer Age of Ultron. I know a lot of people would probably put Doctor Strange higher than this, but this is just where I think it goes. Next is Black Panther. This is another movie which I really liked the first time, and then I slightly went down on it upon rewatch. I still really like this. So I'm going to put it above Guardians 2 and just a little bit below Far From Home for me. This one might be controversial. I just think that the special effects issues in some parts of the movies, particularly the final battle, kind of hold it down for me. And yeah, I mean, there's not a lot to say about this one. It's a great movie. again, as I said before with some of these other ones, it just doesn't stand out the way these other A tier movies do for me personally. Moving on to Captain Marvel, which could be seen as somewhat of a controversial movie, but my sister and I actually rewatched this recently, and we pretty much came to the same exact conclusion on it. We thought that there was a really good foundation here, and they could have done some really interesting things in her first movie. And if they had just made some minor changes, I think it could have easily moved into B tier, potentially even an A tier movie. But for me, the way it is right now, I think there's a few too many flaws with it, and it feels kind of basic and repetitive in terms of the MCU formula. So I have to put it in C tier, and I actually am going to put it below Iron Man 2, only because I personally get more enjoyment out of watching that movie over rewatching Captain Marvel. Moving on to Black Widow, who I probably have a slight bias towards this movie because Scarlett Johansson has always been my favorite actress. And I'm going to put this just ahead of Black Panther here, which I'm sure some of you are probably going to be questioning that, but this is one of the only one that I haven't rewatched yet other than Shang-Chi. So I will most likely change my opinions on this upon rewatch. I think there's a chance, probably a decent chance that it moves down a few spots here, but I do think it will stay at least as a B tier movie. And up next, the other movie that I had just mentioned, Shang-Chi, or Shang-Chi. For me, this is another A tier movie, and I'm gonna put this ahead of Guardians, and just a little bit behind the first Avenger. The only thing really holding this movie back for me is I felt at the end of the movie, in the last 20 or 30 minutes or so, it sort of kind of changes what the movie is about and becomes much more like fantasy and creatures oriented rather than martial arts oriented. And I just preferred the martial arts style action scenes over the final action scene with the big CGI monsters and things. I thought it was executed really well, but that final big CGI mess at the final action scene just brings it down just a little bit for me. But overall, I loved this movie. And now getting into the MCU TV shows, which are all pretty much brand new. I've only seen each of these one time so far. And honestly, the only one that I think I might rewatch would be Loki, because it was my favorite of the TV shows. But starting with WandaVision, I think I'm going to say that this is a B tier project for the MCU, but I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier. I got a little bit more enjoyment out of it than I did from Ant-Man and the Wasp or Thor, but it just doesn't quite capture something the way that I feel these other movies in the B tier do. And moving on next to The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, this was actually one of my biggest disappointments with the MCU. I was expecting this to be good. I really thought it was going to be good. I watched the first episode or two and thought that there was a good chance that this could evolve and become a great show. But just as it went on, I kind of found myself more bored with it and less interested. And it just didn't quite work for me. I'm not sure why. There were definitely parts of this show that worked for me really well. I like the dynamic between Bucky and Sam. I think that those two actors have good chemistry, but it just didn't quite do it for me. So I'm going to put this below Iron Man 2 as well in the C tier. Up next we have Loki, which, as I said already, is my favorite of the MCU TV shows. I think people seem to be sort of divided on this show. Some people give it high praise, some people think it's sloppily written, poorly written, and I do see some issues with it. There's some things that I wish they did a little bit differently, but overall, I had a lot of fun watching this show, and I'm excited for the implications that it potentially has for the future of the MCU. So I'm going to put this in A tier, and I'm going to put this above The First Avenger, and below Homecoming. And lastly, the most recent Marvel project, the first animated project in the MCU, What If? I wasn't really sure what to expect from this show. I wasn't sure what to think about it, but as it started to come out and I watched it, I realized I actually really do enjoy some of the episodes of this. I think some episodes hold up much stronger than others. I really enjoyed the episode about Thor. Um, I think that was one of the standouts for me. I think the comedy really fit with the type of story they were trying to tell in that episode. I think some of the other episodes, like the zombie episode, could have gone with a little bit less humor to them. But overall, I'm going to put this as another C tier project, but I'm going to put it in front of Iron Man 2 and behind The Incredible Hulk.